Zoom now. This program is going live from. Yeah, that's what I said ना, तो मैंने दूसरे लैपटॉप पे लाइव खुलवाया है, वहाँ लिख के आ रहे थे ना, तो मैंने वो कहा है उनको कि दूसरे कंप्यूटर पे लाइव खोल दे, मैं वहाँ से देख के टाइप करूँ. That's what I have said. वो भी यही कह रही है, अरूज भी वही कह रही है, आर बी लाइव. खुर्रम क्यों आए जा रहे हैं? We are live now.
Okay. Tell me when I should share my screen. You let me know.
How come Khurram is still there? ये lag हो रहा है. All right, you're live now. Tell me when I should share my screen. How come Khurram is still there? All right, you're live now. It's lagging, मतलब delay है. How come Khurram is still there?
I think the live stream Hello?
कर दिया मैंने, ये तो मैं खुद भी कर सकती थी. और सूजी भी बंद हो गई.
अच्छा उसको क्लोज कर देना, उस विंडो क्लोज कर दी.
कौन सी वाली? ये अब कहाँ आ रहा है?
वो आ रही है, बंद कर दी.
Is this live? Am I unmute? Okay. Greetings everybody. Band hai? Okay. Greetings everybody. On behalf of Beacon House School System, the organizer of School of Tomorrow events, I'd like to welcome you to A World of Tomorrow, From Darkness to Light, the 12th edition of SOT events, a fully virtual, non-profit SOT event series was launched by Beacon House in the year 2000 as part of its CSR to help inform the direction of the organization while also engaging global communities in conversations shaping the future of schools and societies. I am Narjis Haider, currently a deputy head at one of the Beacon House branches, and I would like to introduce our esteemed panelist, Ms. Suzie Boss, who is an expert in PBL and today is going to talk to us about new paradigms in learning and how we are going to adapt to teaching amidst the pandemic. She is an advocate of project-based learning and has worked with educators on nearly every continent to develop more authentic, real-world learning experiences for students. Her next book, a collaboration with 21st Century Learning advocate Ken Kay on bold leadership for 21st century schools, will be published in 2021. The title of our workshop, Connections, Corrections, and Critical Thinking, Essentials of 21st Century Learning. 21st century skills are competencies that today's students need to succeed in their careers. So Suzie Boss, over to you. And now we shall begin with a very exciting session. Really looking forward to some new learning from you, Suzie. Thank you.
Thanks so much for the introduction. Let me just share my screen and we'll get underway here. Okay, great. Off we go. So thanks so much for that introduction, and thank you for the invitation to join you again for this conference. It's such an important time for educators everywhere to be gathering and to be sharing best practices. We're all in new territory during this time of pandemic, and the more we can learn together and help each other along, the better for all of us, and especially for our students. So let's dig in with a conversation about connections, corrections, and critical thinking, and what this means for 21st century learning. So as you learned from my introduction, I'm based in the US, but I've spent a lot of time working with educators all around the world, especially in South Asia. Many trips to your part of the world. And it's part of this growing interest in helping students become 21st century citizens by rethinking what does teaching and learning look like? How can we support students? And what does that mean for educators in shifting their practice? So a couple of hats that I wear. I've been a long time colleague with PBL Works, which is an organization I'll mention today. It used to be known as the Buck Institute for Education. Many of you may know it for the wealth of project-based learning resources it's developed over the years. And I've also been a longtime contributor to Edutopia. And in both of these roles, again, it allows me to connect with educators like yourselves who are really looking to change the game when it comes to teaching and learning. So let's think about why real-world learning is so important and why it's so important right now. For our students, they are in a time of great upheaval and great change. Of course, all of us are, adults as well, but put yourselves in the shoes of your students. And what are they seeing all around them? They're seeing adults having to really think critically to solve a huge problem. They're seeing adults needing to be creative problem solvers and good communicators. They're seeing adults needing to think critically about what are the best ways to protect us and help us come out of this pandemic and, be able to resume the lives that we all remember and have changed so abruptly. When I work with schools around the globe, we often start by doing some backwards design. We think about what do you want your students to know and be able to do by the time they leave you, by the time they graduate from your school system? And the words that you see on the screen are the ones that most often come up. These are the 21st century skills that we've been talking about now for upwards of 20 years. We're here at 2020 and we're still talking about these as goals rather than realities for our students. So I think for right now, this moment we're in has illustrated to all of us the need to create learning situations where students will grow into these important skills. We don't know what challenges are going to be ahead of them, but we know from this current experience that these are the essential skills for problem solving in the world that we all share. So the faster we can get students on board with these skills, the better off we're all going to be. In the work that I've been doing during these last several months during the pandemic, I've been doing some research on a new book. And my co-author and I, Ken Kay, who's been a longtime advocate of 21st century learning, we've talked with school leaders, some 200 school leaders as part of our research. Many of them have adopted what you see in front of you here on the screen, something like this, their version of a portrait of a graduate. Again, this is a wonderful backwards design strategy, thinking about what is it that we want our students to know and be able to do by the time they graduate from our school system? This is just one example. This one happens to be from the US, but these are sort of the keywords that we see coming up over and over again in these unique, each one unique to its own community, but these representations of our learning goals. We tend to see the 4 C's, creativity, communication, critical thinking, and collaboration, being very prominent in these portrait of a graduate visuals and the goals that go along with them. But also what you see in the center, a citizen of the world, seems to be emerging as a really important goal for school systems. So as we think about that, we have to think about how do we go from this beautiful vision to actual teaching and learning practices that help students grow into these skills. So it's not enough to set the goals. We also have to think about what are we actually doing with our students to reach these goals, to help our students grow into these skills and become citizens of the world. And we have work to do, apparently, as a globe of educators. Just a very recent study from the Brookings Institute called Competencies for the 21st Century took a global look at 21st century learning. And here's one quote I'll let you read for yourselves. But the key takeaway for me was that most countries around the world, and this was a really good cross-section of countries globally, have acknowledged the importance of these skills. The 21st century skills may change a little from country to country. There's pretty good consistency of the 4 C's and then perhaps something else like global citizenship. But most countries have acknowledged that these are really important. They've set them as either national or regional goals. But as the researchers for this study dug into their work, they found that there was a big gap between the goals and what was actually happening in classrooms around the world. That while these are high-level policies, there are not necessarily through lines to professional learning for educators, to curriculum development, to pedagogy in the classroom. So that the skills are not getting to students. They're not getting all the way to our students. We're still kind of at that high level of aspiration. And so I think the challenge ahead of us is thinking about how do we get these to our classrooms and get to the end result where these goals are not just aspirational, but students are talking about them. They're using the language, they're using their abilities to collaborate, communicate, think critically, et cetera, and reflecting on their growth. We're hearing evidence of this in their own words and in their own actions. So that's the challenge ahead of us. Layered on top of that, we have this unprecedented pandemic where our students have been disrupted from their normal routines around the world. Schools are trying to navigate, what does this mean? How do we open schools safely? Or if we're going to stick with virtual learning, how do we do that effectively? And what I've heard over and over again from educators, from students themselves, from parents, from school leaders, is that this is an opportunity not to revert to the most traditional teaching. That might be the easiest thing to do, to pull out the worksheets and stick with more traditional, recall of information. But this is not the time for that. What we need are students to be really engaged in learning, whether they're doing that virtually or whether they're face-to-face with you. They need opportunities to connect with their peers and connect with their fellow with their teachers. They need that relationship. And we're not going to get all those benefits if we revert to kind of old school teaching and learning where students are told what to think, how to think, and can they regurgitate what we've told them. This is not a time for worksheets. This is a time for innovation and for project-based learning, because that's going to pull together a lot of these threads that we're talking about. So just to make sure we're all on the same page here, I want to just briefly mention what I mean when I talk about project-based learning. I mentioned that I've been a longtime member of the PBL Works National Faculty and have done a lot of writing for them. This, again, used to be the Buck Institute for Education until some rebranding recently, a new name that puts PBL front and center. And several years back now, this organization developed this framework that you see in front of you for gold standard project-based learning. This is a design framework to help teachers think about what's most important when you're designing teaching and learning experiences for your students, to make sure that they get to the learning goals at the center of this framework. And I won't go through the whole framework now, but I just want to say that when teachers are taking project-based learning seriously, when they're really kind of living up to the opportunities that PBL offers, this is not something that happens after the end of a traditional unit. It's not done just for fun, or sometimes we say just as dessert. It's the main course of learning. It is the way that you help students get deeply into the content, the way you help them explore the curriculum, help them reach important learning goals. And while they're building those learning goals around academics, they're also developing 21st century skills. That's what you see in the center of the graphic here around success skills. That's another way to talk about 21st century skills. So you're really crisp as a teacher on what are the learning goals. Again, backwards design is really important here, starting with the end in mind. By the end of this project, what do I want my students to know and be able to do? And then the whole process is an experience that you share with your students. You dig in together with a really important and interesting question or problem that you're going to tackle. It involves a lot of research and inquiry to surface answers and to get deeper into understanding. The more real world projects are, the more students relate to them, the more engaged they are. Throughout the project, you want to see students using their own voice, making decisions, reflecting on their learning as they're coming up with a solution or an answer to that challenging problem or question. They're getting feedback so they can take their work, make it better, make multiple drafts. And by the time they get to an audience, a public audience that's going to care about their work, what they have to share is of high quality. So the whole experience unfolds over time. It's not a 1 or 2 day event. It requires some digging in and some facilitation by you as a teacher to help students get to those learning goals in the center. So when I'm talking about project-based learning, I'm talking about this whole experience, this gold standard framework of taking students deeply into content, learning and applying their learning to come up with a solution, create something new, and then share it with an audience. As a teacher, you may need to develop some new strategies to be successful with project-based learning. But what I've found is that many of your best strategies that you've been using all along as a teacher have a place in project-based learning. They have a really important place, in fact. And we know that some of the highest impact strategies, what leads to best results for students, are as important in project-based learning as they are in any kind of learning experience. So we know from research that education generally works best when teachers have high expectations for all their students. They want all their students to be able to achieve at a high level and to reach meaningful goals. We know that learning works best when the relationship between students and teachers is strong. So getting to know your students, finding out what they care about. That's a really important part of learning generally and critically important in project-based learning as you design learning experiences that are going to engage your students and going to make sense to them and be relevant to their lives. We know, again, from research generally that feedback, useful feedback, helpful, frequent feedback, and time to apply it is one of our best strategies to improve learning. And in project-based learning, feedback is built into the experience. It's part of the learning cycle. And then finally, we know from research that it's important to help students be reflective about their own learning, that when they're learning a new strategy, you're transparent about that and you actually teach them new ways to learn. And that's part of the PBL experience too, because students are having to learn in new ways when they're more active participants in their own learning and not passive recipients as they've been in the past. So as you help students get better at things like asking really good questions, you're transparent about that. You're helping them think about how can I get better at asking questions, or how can I become a more reflective learner who thinks about my own thinking. That's very intentional and deliberate. And again, these are high impact strategies generally, but in project-based learning, I think they're critically important to the success of the learning experience. So can we do this during a pandemic? That's been a really big question around the globe. And the answer is yes, based on what I'm seeing anecdotally. I'll share just a few examples with you. And if you'd like to use the chat, I know some of you have access to the chat. If you'd like to use the chat to share an example, perhaps of a project you've done during the pandemic, we'd love to see that. So let me just explain to you, describe for you a few examples of what I've been seeing that I think illustrates the potential of using the moment, using what students are experiencing right now as an opportunity for deep learning. So just a few quick examples. Let's say your students are involved in a class that has to do with history and language arts. So for a project, students are interviewing their family members about what it's like to be living through this pandemic and creating podcasts to share the highlights of those interviews. So students are learning the skills of being an historian who's capturing first-person accounts of history, capturing oral histories and interpreting those to tell a really great story. That's something that they can do right in their own homes, interviewing the family members all around them, or perhaps using tools like Zoom to reach maybe more distant family members. A second example involving geography and math, students might create infographics that have to do with the data around the pandemic in their own communities. Where are the outbreaks? Where are the hotspots? What can we do to stay safer? And then students can use these infographics that they create to educate public audiences. That's another example where students are now in the role of public health advocates, and they're educating families, community members, their peers, and they're having to apply their understanding of what's happening with the pandemic and their understanding of data to create original material that they use for education. So that's another example. A third one, imagine your students in a math class in the role of being financial planners. But now they have clients who are, small business owners trying to adjust to work disruptions or recover from a closure, perhaps. And students can help them with a financial business plan to get back on their feet, think about what are the opportunities and how can we move forward as a business owner. And the final example I'll share, I've seen this one a lot, where students are in the role of journalists and they are creating stories across different platforms in more traditional print, in digital media, in broadcasting, and they're filling the void that many communities are facing with a lack of local news coverage, what I call hyper-local news coverage, right about their own communities. What is it that what's the story of the moment that they can tell and interpret? And you'll notice in each of these examples, students are in a particular role. They're journalists or they're financial planners or they're data analytics folks. This is something you see a lot in high quality project-based learning. Students step into a real world authentic role and they take on the thinking skills and the strategies and the way that people in that role in the world go about doing important business. So students are getting a taste of what's ahead. Now, there are some shifts necessary, of course, if we're having to do project-based learning virtually or in a blended situation. This is a comment from one of my colleagues in the PBL Works National Faculty who took a project that already existed. She took one from a project library and she made a pivot. She adjusted it to work in a virtual setting. She had to do some modifications, but her goals were still to have students go through all the processes that you do in high quality project-based learning. She was attending to all those same goals in the gold standard framework that I mentioned earlier. And she was really keeping a sharp eye on equity so that every student in the project, every student in her class would have access, would be able to connect, would be able to participate fully. This emphasis on equity is becoming so important during the pandemic when we're finding some students are not able to connect as easily or they're not as engaged. And so we really need to think about how can we draw them all in to the learning experience. So I wanted to share with you some examples of the many digital tools that can support you. And if you have access to the chat, if you could add perhaps your own examples of tools that are supporting your students in inquiry experiences, in project-based learning experiences. Let me just talk through these briefly, just to give you an idea of what's available to you as a teacher as you're designing projects and really attending to the learning throughout. At the center of this, the graphic you see in the center describes project-based learning in a little different way. It shows the 4 phases that most projects go through, regardless of how old your students are or what content level, what content area you're teaching. And I'll just describe those quickly, and then let's look at some of the tools that can support your learning goals at each of these phases. At the top there, the project launches with something to inspire inquiry, to get students wondering, asking questions, being curious. Then they move from that toward starting to answer their own questions by building understanding, doing some research, perhaps with some direct instruction from you, some traditional teaching activities you've done before to build understanding. Those come into play in that second phase. Then they apply what they've learned to develop products and finally share them with an audience. So if you think about the first phase, launching a project, if you were doing this face-to-face, you might bring in a guest speaker, or you might take students out on a field trip. You might create some kind of experience. Virtually, you might use technology to connect them with a guest speaker or a TED Talk or something that's going to get them curious and excited about the topics ahead. And then you want to capture their questions. Padlet, which we're going to use in a few minutes today, is a good one. And I see in the chat, folks are mentioning Padlet and Jamboard as good examples of ways to capture student questions. That's great at project launch. And what's also great about digital tools for this purpose is that then you've got a record you can continue to build on. You can keep going back to that Padlet as students ask deeper and richer questions as they start to learn more. So then you shift into building understanding of the content area itself, building their knowledge. Now you might use a tool like Nearpod to curate resources for your students, where you're thinking critically about what resources do I have available? How do I get those to students? That's one tool to use. You might use something like Explain Everything as a virtual whiteboard for students to share their thinking, share their understanding. And you want to be checking on their thinking as you go along. So using formative assessment for things like digital exit tickets to check for understanding, or having students share on social media what are their key questions at certain places, or a game like Kahoot to check for understanding. Now we're shifting to developing and critiquing products. So you're shifting from building that understanding to applying it. How do we use digital tools to help at this point? Again, you think critically about what are the learning goals at this point. You want to check in on the process. Are students managing teamwork together? A tool like Trello might help with that. This is a tool that helps you think, students set goals. What am I working on now? What needs to be done next? And what are we finished with? That helps them with their own self-management of their time and their teamwork. And you've got just a world of tools available to use for creation of digital products. This is a great opportunity to use these powerful tools for students to create something new, share their thinking, apply their learning to create a product. So everything from book creator to podcasting tools to digital storytelling, all of those are possibilities for this develop and critique phase. And at the same time, you want to maintain that emphasis on reflection, getting students to think about themselves as learners. So using tools like Flipgrid or blogs for students to reflect on their thinking. Those are really great tools to keep that alive and well during this phase. And then finally, when you're ready to present products, connecting students with an audience, an authentic audience, is just as important as ever, but it may not happen face-to-face because we're in this unusual time. So you might use something like Zoom, like we're using now, or Google Meet or Skype to connect students with an authentic audience. They're still going to get that opportunity to take their learning, communicate it to an audience, and have an audience appreciate what they've accomplished. In continuing to encourage reflection throughout, tools like Seesaw are helpful for capturing their reflections. These are just examples. The little yellow stickies you see here, these are just examples to kind of get you thinking about what are my learning goals at this phase of the project? What's a tool available to me and to my students that's going to be pretty easy for us to use, so we don't spend a lot of time having to learn the tool. Instead, we're using our time to dig deeply into our own thinking about the project ahead. So just an example there. And I want to really reinforce, because we're talking about 21st century learning in the session, I want to reinforce that your learning goals have to do with those success skills, the 21st century skills, just as much as they do with the academic side. And these might be skills that students need some deliberate instruction to get good at. You can't just assume that students are going to know how to collaborate because you've designed a project with teamwork in mind. You may need to teach them some really intentional ways to be good collaborators, to be participants in a team, how to bring ideas together. So you see on the right an example of a fun game-based collaborative activity. There are a wealth of these available to you, but early in the project, if collaboration is going to be really important, make sure your students get some experience with collaboration. And again, reflect on their thinking as they learn to work with others. What's hard about that? What are they really good at? Are they listening to all the other voices? How does that benefit them? Are they getting their own voice into the conversation? The same with brainstorming, as you see on the left. You might need to help students really intentionally think about, how do we come up with good ideas? How do we build put interesting ideas together to create something new? So think about the success skills, the 21st century skills that you're aiming for, and be really deliberate about making sure students are learning to use these. Remember my earlier comment about these 21st century skills not necessarily getting all the way to the classroom. Here's your opportunity to change that and to make sure that your students are not just knowing that these are goals to acquire someday, but they're getting experiences right now, today, that deepen their understanding and their ability to put these 21st century skills to work. And PBL is the perfect opportunity for that because it's built right into the model that you need to be thinking about those success skills, those 21st century skills in project design and implementation. And I see teachers being very creative about how do they unpack these 21st century skills. Remember, I mentioned the goal is to hear these competencies, hear discussion of them in students' own voices. I visited an elementary classroom that had done a big deep dive into collaboration. And what does this mean? What does it mean to collaborate? They had done a lot of activities, thinking, learning, talking, interviewing, using all their great language arts skills to understand what does collaboration mean? What does it mean to us? What does it mean to the world? And I thought students came up with a beautiful metaphor that collaboration for them is about snapping ideas together. But it took them some work, some careful, artful facilitation by the teacher to get to that point where they really understood what does collaboration mean? Why is it so beneficial? The same thing with students' communication skills. We know this is an important 21st century skill to be able to share ideas, to be able to communicate them to an authentic audience. We can't assume that students naturally come by these communication skills. We have to actually intentionally teach them and give them time to practice. So that might mean starting small, having students maybe present in pairs to another group of peers before they step in front of a large public audience, helping them grow into these skills, giving them time to critique each other as communicators and learn from people who are good communicators, critique and evaluate other people's performances and communication skills, and think about how do I get better at this? How do I get my ideas across? If I'm going to come up with a really interesting idea for a product or a solution, I want other people to be as excited about it as I am. So how do I use my communication skills to grow that audience, to grow that engagement with my solution or my product? How do I get my ideas into the world? And when it comes to global citizenship, which is another 21st century goal I've been hearing about from teachers all around the world, I want to point you to the Sustainable Development Goals and the community of practice that's grown up around teaching the SDGs, as it's known. There's a great website for Teach SDGs, where the idea is to look at these global goals, which have been signed on to by countries all around the world, 17 major goals. I think of these as project-based learning for the whole planet. These are goals to help the world get to a more equitable, sustainable future. And in designing projects, one of the ways I've seen teachers get creative about project design is to look at these global goals, think about what's a local connection I can make to one of these goals that also connects to my content area. And so in doing the project, students are going to probably focus locally on problem solving, but they're going to see how the work they're doing relates to a much larger goal. They see themselves as citizens of the world when they tackle one of these global goals in their own community. So for an example, there's a school in Georgia in the US that has a new course really focused on problem solving. And one of the projects underway right now is around global goal number 1, which is no poverty. And the way they're thinking about it is, how can I be, the one who leads change in the world to alleviate poverty? And how can I help in my own community? So in tackling that project, students are needing to explore and understand the causes and underlying conditions that lead to poverty, the implications of that, not only locally, but globally. Why is this an issue for the whole world to focus on? And then for their action side, applying their learning, they're thinking about what can I do in my own community? So this is a really nice structure to think about building global citizenship. I've seen amazing examples connected to almost all of these. Just another quick example around quality education, which is goal number 4, something students naturally are connected to, but helping them think about what are the challenges, who's excluded from quality education, or who's not being able to reap all of the benefits of education that quality education offers. How can we improve the quality of education? All those sorts of questions help students dig into this issue, think about it globally, and then think about what can we do right in our own communities to improve quality education. So again, for an example, some students realized that the community that they live in happens to be what's known as a book desert. This is a term I wasn't familiar with. I've heard of food deserts where there's not good access to high quality, local, affordable food, but I hadn't heard of book deserts. These are places where there are not easy access to libraries, where books and resources online are in short supply. There may not be great internet connection to get people to that world of information that's online. So these students thought hard about what can we do to improve access to reading materials across our community. And they came up with their solution, or what are a popular thing I'm seeing around the world now, tiny libraries, little tiny book lending libraries about the size of a mailbox. And students created these, decorated them, placed them around their community. So they're free books that you can borrow and return without needing a library card. And to make sure that these were well stocked with important books, students did a book drive and collected hundreds of books, particularly to appeal to children. And then they make sure that these little libraries, tiny little libraries, are well stocked with books that children are going to enjoy. So in their own community, they've kind of helped move the needle when it comes to quality education. And what's that all about? Okay. So what I want us to take just a moment to do together to see if we can get a little more collaboration into our own workshop today is to think about who are your allies who could help you improve project planning. One of the best ways to plan a project is to brainstorm ideas together, to collaborate with other teachers about getting your ideas out there and taking what I call a starter idea for a project and making it better before you begin a more detailed planning process. Just do a little bit of brainstorming about the ideas. Are these going to engage your learners? Are they going to develop 21st century skills? So what I'd like us to do is I'm going to take about 5 minutes out of our workshop time, and I'd like you to open this Padlet. You see the tinyurl.com right there. I'm going to open it on my different device and see what ideas emerge. But what I'm hoping that you'll do here is share your starter ideas for projects. You also can use the Padlet to comment on each other's ideas. So if you see an idea that you like, an idea that you think has real merit, you can star that, you can add a comment, you can say what you like about it, offer each other some helpful feedback in terms of likes and wonders. And let's just take a few minutes here, let's say 3 minutes, to give you a chance to share some of your ideas about projects that you think will engage your students, could work virtually, and we're going to build these 21st century skills that we've been talking about that we need to get right in the hands of students. So I'm just going to be quiet for a moment or two and see if some ideas start to percolate.
What happened, Suzie? Are you doing something?
Yes, I was encouraging folks who are listening to go to this Padlet.
All right.
And add their ideas for projects. I don't see anything yet. I'm hoping that folks are typing away and we'll get some project ideas initiated here on the screen.
There are some questions that people had posted, which I have placed for you in the chat.
Okay, maybe while I'm hoping that people will post to the Padlet, I'm not seeing anything yet. I'll just give them another minute here to add some ideas. And actually, I can go on to this next screen. And I will, here's the link again for the Padlet. Here's what it should look like. You should be able to just click on this if you're watching and add your idea. And I've got it live on another screen. I'm keeping an eye on it. Don't see any ideas posted yet, but I hope they're out there. So I see some questions. Let's take a look at those. The first one is around learning spaces. How can classrooms, home and digital classrooms work together for project-based learning? This is so relevant right now as we have students working in different ways and in different settings. Some of the learning is happening at home for sure. Some of it is happening entirely virtually. And I think it depends, how is your school working right now? Is it entirely virtual? Is it a combination? Are you blended? Are you alternating days? You know, we're seeing all of those kinds of configurations of classrooms. So I think this is a time to find out, where are students going to be working together? Where are they connecting? And then as you design the project, make sure that whatever the project calls for in terms of resources, that students are going to have access. So if they're working from home and they don't have access to perhaps fast internet or video editing equipment, don't design a project that calls on those skills. Think of some lower tech ways for students to make meaning. Perhaps they're going to make some drawings or schematics on paper and then share those with a photo, a digital photo with their cameras, instead of, you know, creating a digital story that requires some higher tech equipment that they might not have. So make sure that wherever they're connecting from, they have the resources that they need. You might need to do some surveying of students to find out, what do you have access to, what's available to you at home. And at the same time, you want to think about who's supporting them. If they're doing more learning from home, who else is in the household who might be able to help them, depending on the age of your students. If they're a little older, high school students, middle school students, they can be more independent online. But if they're younger, they're going to need some facilitation from their parents. So their parents might be in a new role. There's some great problem solving online about how to do project-based learning from home with really young learners. There's a Facebook group that I'll share. I'll tweet out the link to that. I don't have it right in front of me, but I'll share that out. So be thinking about where they're learning from, who's going to support them, and what resources do they have. I would start there. Let's see. I think another question is around how to design more focused driving questions. Look at lots and lots of examples. If you go to PBL Works, for example, you'll see a project library that you can explore. Each of the projects included there has a driving question. I think getting a read on what do good driving questions sound like. Your goals are to come up with a question that's open-ended, so students can't just go Google their way to an answer, and then interesting to them and will lead them to their learning goals. So the more project examples you can look at, the more you can think about what would a quality question sound like. And I really like questions that put students right into the question. So how can we as journalists tell the stories of the pandemic? Or how can we as financial planners help small businesses recover? Things like that. You don't have to put every single learning goal in the question, but the question should be worded in such a way that in order to answer it well, students are going to have to dig into some understanding. They're going to have to learn the content that, you know, is part of your design of the project. And then another question, what are the major challenges of PBL? And I think that's where I was going to go next with a couple more slides. So let me go ahead with those, and then we can come back to any final questions at the end. Okay, so both challenges, troubleshooting, and just tips for success is kind of where I wanted to close our conversation today. The first one is to really think about engaging experts. You as a teacher don't have to know absolutely everything that your students are investigating. What you do need to know is, how can we learn together? So if my students are asking questions that really are beyond what I know about this content area, how can I connect them with people who can share their expertise and also be role models? So if you're doing a science project that's more specialized than your understanding of science, how could you connect in person or virtually with scientists who can help? Or think of all the other connections that your projects will lead to with professions beyond the classroom, real world professions. How can you find people in your parent community or in your own network of friends or online who could share their understanding of this area? So engaging with experts is a really good way to avoid one of the major challenges of PBL, and that is teachers feeling like this is more complicated than I'm ready for. I don't know all the answers. What do I do about that? So be ready to be a learner yourself and give yourself permission to learn alongside your students as you connect with experts who are going to support their journey. That's one tip. Another one is to continue giving students opportunities to be of service, even if it's virtually. We're hearing this from students themselves, that they want to have an opportunity to make a difference, particularly in this really challenging time we're in. They want to be problem solvers, and they want to support their communities. So this is an example of a project that was done in Brazil, where students created their own masks. We know we need masks for safety, so they created their own mask designs that kind of revealed who am I, and they used different artistic methods to come up with great masks, and then they digitally printed them and made them available for sale as a fundraiser to support people in their community who needed support. Through this project, students not only created something new and interesting, applying their understanding of the arts, but they felt like they made a difference. So look for opportunities for students to feel like I'm contributing as a citizen. I'm doing something good for my community. That's something we're hearing from students themselves that they really want right now. And we know that's going to connect to the social and emotional side of learning as well. And then connecting with audiences is, of course, critically important. We've talked about that a lot. It could be just one person, could be the perfect audience for your students' work if that person is deeply connected to the problem that your students are trying to solve. Here you see, an audience of one, but students are just listening for his every word because they really want his feedback on what they've come up with, because this is his area of expertise. They're kind of in the sweet spot. They're developing a solution to a problem that he works with in his life every day. So think about how you can find those audiences, even virtually, to keep your students motivated, to help them feel like their work is being heard and is making a difference. Two more tips for you. One is to be more creative about giving students choice to show evidence of their learning. How can they share what they know or what they can do? They're not all necessarily sitting with you in the same classroom. They might have access to different tools and materials from each other. So give them more latitude when it comes to what kind of a product could I create? What do I have to work with at home? How can I make my learning known? How can I make application of my knowledge known to you? And allow them to suggest ways to share their learning, share evidence of their learning that you might not have thought of, as this young lady did in the science project, where she came up with an idea to make theater masks that showed her understanding of material science. Not something the science teacher would have thought of, but she did. And so it was meaningful for her. And then finally, help students recognize when they've made a difference. This is a huge part of the success of project-based learning. When students feel like we've made an impact, it may be small, but we've made a difference. These are some students in India who tackled a project about reducing noise pollution in their busy city, noisy city of Bombay. And then finally, think about the benefits for you as a teacher. These are just a few comments I'll kind of leave on the screen as we get into some Q&A time. For teachers, there are benefits as well. We know that PBL is good for students when it's engaging, when it gives them opportunities to learn deeply. But for students, it's a great way to get to know your students better. Some teachers find that project-based learning reinvigorates them, reminds them why they went into this profession in the first place. So let's see if we have a little time for Q&A and wrap up, and back to you, Narjis.
Thanks a lot, Suzie. Yes, so I've already posted the questions for you in the chat. So did you get a chance to see all of them? Like one of the questions is, what are the major challenges of online PBL? Where can a teacher get support for virtual PBL? How to get authentic audiences during the pandemic?
Okay, sure. Let me tackle a couple of those. I think that the major challenge with online PBL is for teachers to have the courage to give this a try in a virtual context. It's not the easiest thing to do. It's going to require you to stretch and make some adjustments, and it may not be perfect. But the benefits for your students are going to be enormous if they're more engaged, if they're wanting to show up, if they're developing the skills that you want. So how can you get support for that? I mentioned PBL Works. It's pblworks.org. There's a great set of resources there about doing project-based learning virtually. And again, I'll tweet out some of these links after our session today. That's one really great site. There's another site called EL Education. This is a group that does entirely project-based learning with students, mostly in the US, but they've also created a really great set of virtual tools to help teachers imagine what could this look like, when I'm doing this online. And a couple of just really key things to keep in mind is your students don't have to be with you the entire time that they're learning. You can come together as a whole class. Then perhaps you can split into smaller groups. If you're using something like Zoom, you might have students work in breakout rooms to continue that teamwork, have them in small groups to learn together and give each other peer feedback, those sorts of things, and then come back together again as a whole group. So you don't have to be kind of looking over their shoulders or having them follow your lead at every moment in a virtual class. You can give them a little more latitude to learn independently and learn in small groups, just as you would if you were all together in the same classroom. When you walk into a high functioning PBL classroom, you don't see the teacher leading students through every step of learning. You see the teacher setting the context, providing resources, and then kind of getting them off and going in their group work, in their small group work or their independent study work, and then reconnecting, bringing them back together as a community of learners. Where are we now? Where are we trying to get to with this project? So those are a couple tips and a couple resources for you. A question around authentic audiences. I would look to your own parent community for possibilities there, especially if you have parents who in some way are connected to the challenge that your students are tackling. So either in their work or in their volunteering, their community service, or just in the problems they're experiencing and are looking for solutions for, they might be your first kind of circle of audience. And they may know people who can bring into that audience as well. So starting with parents, working outward from there is a great networking skill. Let's see, we talked a little bit about online tools, and my strongest advice for you around online tools is to be really selective in two areas. One, make sure that these are tools every student will have access to. You don't want to create equity issues by having some students unable to engage in the project because they don't have, a video camera or they don't have high quality equipment that they need to do a project. So make sure you're choosing tools that are accessible to all your learners, and then make sure the tool really meets the learning goals of that part of the project. You might need several different tools as you go through those phases of the project that I talked about earlier, from inspiring curiosity to building understanding to developing a solution and then sharing it. Different tools are going to serve you really well and serve your learners well at different points in the process. So I would encourage you to think critically about what is it we're trying to accomplish right now, and then look for kind of the easiest to use tool that's going to support my learners with that. Any other questions that I overlooked?
Yes, I'm going to read that one out to you.
Sure.
I did an art integration project of rainforest with class 2 kids, and the results were amazing.
That's
so
pretty
the
exciting.
comment. Yeah.
That's wonderful. That's what we want to hear. And, I hope whoever did that project is finding ways to share it publicly, tweet out photos from what students created. I bet it's beautiful if it integrated the art. So you're going to inspire others to give this a try as well.
All right. The next question is that after COVID, it's really difficult to dive into, to make children engaged in projects and project-based learning.
That as a result of COVID or during COVID, is that the question?
I think what she means is due to lockdown and children being at home.
Yeah. So I think this is why you really need to look for projects that are going to connect to students' lives. What are they worried about right now? What are they frustrated about? What are they challenged by during this lockdown? A teacher working with really young students, early elementary and primary years students, got children thinking about what can we create at home that would make life more fun during this pandemic. So they got creative about game design, about activities they could do to, get a little bit of exercise with their families. In developing these ideas, they had to think critically about what are we frustrated about in our own homes, then what do we have to work with? What could we create? And then using their communication skills, how can we explain that to others? How can we take our idea and make it public, to other kids, in this case, other children who are looking for ways to keep life more entertaining at home? So you don't have to look far beyond their immediate context to find ways to make learning meaningful. So I think rather than trying to push them in the direction of your existing curriculum or the content goals, content in the way you've perhaps always taught it, this is a time of necessity for you to think really critically yourself about how can I engage my students in learning about the content we need to learn, but that it addresses issues they really are worried about and are caring about right now. So you really have to challenge yourself to create more engaging projects and to have conversations with your students about what are they worried about, what do they care about, what are they missing from life before the pandemic. How can we design projects in response to those things that are, so driving their attention span and are affecting them socially and emotionally right now? Oops, you need to unmute, Narjis.
Yeah, that's a great answer, Susie, and a very interesting insight. I really like this question that how can different learning spaces be used, because using a blend of the home and the virtual classroom, and especially with the hybrid model that we're having right now, where children do face-to-face school 2 days a week and then they do 3 days of online. So I think you have given very great ideas to how to mix online tools and some face-to-face learning and some offline learning, and then make it work. Thank you very much, Susie. There's a question here: which academic standards are the focus of the units when they are planned for PBL?
Project-based learning can really work in any content area. You think what you want to focus on your academic standards are those kind of higher level, more important academic standards. You don't want to design a whole project around a learning goal that you could accomplish in a day or so of more traditional teaching. If it's kind of something that's easy and quick to learn, that's not a good match for project-based learning. Look for those more ambitious learning goals, like standards that are kind of at a higher prominence in your curriculum, and design projects around those. But it really can work in every content area. We have not, I think sometimes math is the most challenging for teachers to imagine. How do we do PBL in math if we've taught it very traditionally and in a very set order? But there are so many great examples of using math for problem solving. And I think looking at those project libraries I mentioned earlier and seeing how is math being used, integrated in really meaningful ways in PBL shows you the possibilities there.
That's great. Susie, there's another question here. What are the major challenges of online PBL? I think our audience is quite interested in trying this out, so it would be good if you could give some suggestions.
Yes. So I guess on the suggestion side, I would encourage you to try something short term. If it's your first online PBL experience, design a project that's going to last maybe a couple of weeks. So it may not be the most complex project you ever do, but it's going to give you a sense of what do my students need to know to be successful with this? How can I support them through the process? And if it only lasts a couple weeks, be sure that you include all those 4 phases that I mentioned. So you still have, you're kicking it off with something that's going to inspire curiosity. Then you're building understanding. Then they're applying that, and then they're sharing that. Those 4 stages kind of move you through the PBL process. So I'd encourage you to design with those stages in mind, and at the same time, be really transparent with your students about talking with them about, this is something new. We're going to try this if we haven't done it before. Here's why we're doing this. This is going to be a way for you to have more voice in your learning, to connect what you're learning about with your life, things you care about. If you've designed a project based on what you know about your students, let them know that, I've heard you guys talking about whatever it might be. We're going to do a project that digs into this more deeply because I know this is an issue you care about. And then also let them know there's an audience coming, that whatever they create or construct, someone's going to care about that. And there will be an audience to engage with. And that tends to drive the engagement as well, drive their motivation to stay with it and to learn more deeply and to do a really great job. Those would be a few tips. So start small and build from there, and then reach out to the online community of folks who are doing project-based learning for suggestions and advice. And if you're online, if you're using Twitter, there's a hashtag PBL chat, connects you with a community of practice of teachers doing projects all around the world. And if you're looking for an expert or you're looking for an audience, that might be a good starting point for you.
All right, Suzie, thanks a lot. You need to now stop sharing screen so I can appear and wrap up this session.
Great. There we go. Okay, great.
Okay, thank you very much, Suzie. That was a really interesting session. I learned a lot from it as well, and I'm going to take away a few of what I gathered today from this session. Some of the key points you made today: 21st century learning goals have been widely adopted, but are not yet making much of an impact in the classroom. The pandemic has forced educators everywhere to imagine a new normal, like one of the questions about using all learning spaces available, which is the home, the virtual, and the face-to-face school. So that's a great idea. And then project-based learning, when done well, builds students' 21st century skills and global citizenship skills as well. So I think that's another great point you made today. And brainstorming project ideas with fellow teachers will help us create more focused driving questions. Thank you very much, Suzie, for this really insightful session. I really enjoyed hosting it and working with you. And I'm going to try a lot of things that you have suggested today in my own school. Also, I would like to thank you, all the audience that are out there who have watched this workshop or participated in it, asked the questions. Thank you to our event sponsor, UBL. Thank you to the organizers. Thank you, Beacon House. Good night, good day, wherever you are. Thank you very
Thanks
much.
so much for thanks for your facilitation and the invitation to participate, and wish all who are listening good luck with online learning and with PBL and with your students.
All right. Thank you.
Wonderful.
कर दिया ना